If you were an investor, looking for the absolute hottest commodity on the market, where would your mind go?
Well, you'd probably be thinking cutting edge, something new.
Exactly. The newest 2-nanometer microchips, maybe, or some rare earth mineral that's essential for, I don't know, quantum computing. Something small, shiny, futuristic.
That's where the smart money usually looks.
Yeah.
We're sort of conditioned to think that value is tied to complexity, to miniaturization.
But what if I told you that the actual winner, the thing that governments and tech giants are practically fighting over right now in early 2026, is a piece of industrial equipment that was invented in the 1880s? It's huge, it's heavy, it sits in an ugly metal box on the side of the road, and without it, the modern world is basically a paperweight.
It sounds like a riddle, but you're talking about the electrical transformer.
I am.
And frankly, it's about time this technology got its moment in the sun. We often ignore infrastructure until it breaks, or, in this case, until it runs out.
That is the hook for today. We are looking at a perfect storm that's hit the global energy market. We have a massive shortage of these critical components.
A huge shortage.
Which has triggered a historic export boom from China. And, just to top it off, we have a brand new, eye-watering investment plan from China's State Grid 4 trillion RMB that is going to fundamentally change how electricity is managed.
This is a story that connects everything. It really does. It connects the ChatGPT query you ran this morning to a factory in Jiangsu, and it connects the green energy transition to the hard realities of supply chains.
The physical bottleneck of the AI revolution.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack these 3 layers. First, why the world has suddenly run out of transformers. Then the staggering numbers behind China's exports in 2025. And finally, this massive domestic supergrid project that starts now in 2026.
Let's start with the shortage, because I don't think people realize just how precarious this situation is. I mean, we aren't talking about a delay in getting a new iPhone.
Yeah.
We're talking about the inability to connect new power sources to the grid. Period.
I was looking at that report you shared from Wood Mackenzie, and the numbers for the U.S. market specifically are startling. They're estimating a 30% supply gap for power transformers.
A 30% gap it's effectively a crisis. Think about what that means. If you're a utility company and you need 10 massive transformers to update a substation or connect a new solar farm,
right?
The market is telling you, sorry, we can only give you 7. What do? You delay projects. You patch up old equipment that should have been retired a decade ago.
And it's not just the big stuff, is it? The report also mentioned distribution transformers, the smaller cans you see on utility poles.
The gap there is about 10%. And that sounds manageable until you realize the sheer volume is so much higher. Every new housing development, every new mall needs these.
So if you can't get them?
Construction stalls.
Yeah.
And the timeline for this isn't weeks or months. Experts are looking at this extending well into the 2030s.
Why is it so hard to just make more? I feel like we ask this every time there's a shortage. I mean, it's not a microchip. It doesn't need a clean room. It's copper and steel.
It is deceptively difficult. Yes, it's copper and steel, but it's a highly specialized electrical steel, grain-oriented steel that's already in short supply.
Okay.
And the winding of the coils is a precision task. It takes skilled labor. You can't just throw bodies at it. It takes years to build the capacity. But the bigger issue here is that demand didn't just grow. It exploded.
And this brings us to the tech angle. We keep hearing that AI is power hungry. But is it really shifting the needle on global industrial equipment demand?
It is shifting the needle and then, breaking the needle. Look at the data from Guotai Heitong Securities. The global data center market was worth about $242 billion back in 2024.
Okay.
By 2032, it's projected to hit nearly $585 billion. That's massive. But the money isn't the important metric here. It's the physics.
You mentioned in our pre-show chat that it's not just about the amount of power AI needs, but how that power is generated.
This is what I call the green paradox of the AI boom. Tech companies, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, they have all committed to net zero goals. They don't want their data centers running on coal.
They want wind and solar.
Right, but renewable energy is incredibly hardware intensive.
Walk us through that. Why does a wind farm need more transformers than, say, a coal plant?
It's all about density. If you have a coal plant, you have one massive generator in one location. You step that voltage up with one giant transformer and shoot it down the line. It's centralized.
Simple enough.
Now take a wind farm. You have 50, maybe 100 turbines spread across square miles. Each turbine is a mini power plant. It needs its own converter and transformer to get the power to a collection point.
Ah, I see.
Then you need a substation to step it up again. And then, at the data center itself, you need another massive bank of transformers to step it all down safely for the servers.
So by going green, you're effectively doubling the amount of heavy industrial equipment required to move the same number of electrons.
Precisely. You're trading fuel density for equipment density. And that mismatch, this desperate need for green power for AI, combined with the difficulty of building the gear, that's what created this huge opportunity.
An opportunity for Chinese manufacturers.
A massive one.
Okay, so let's look at the scoreboard for 2025. We have the data from Chinese customs, and it is a record breaker.
It was a historic year. Total exports of transformers from China hit 64.6 billion RMB. That's a nearly 36% increase compared to the previous year.
36%.
I mean, in the heavy machinery world, you usually high-five over 5% growth. 36 is a gold rush.
And the pricing is interesting, too. They aren't just selling these at a discount to move volume.
Far from it. The average export price per unit hit 205,000 RMB, which is up by about a third. This tells you everything you need to know about the market. Buyers are desperate.
Right.
When you're a utility in Europe or the US and your domestic supplier quotes you a 3-year lead time, price sensitivity kind of goes out the window. You just need the equipment.
I find that dynamic fascinating given the geopolitical climate. We spend so much time talking about trade wars and tariffs and decoupling, but it seems like when the lights are flickering, ideology takes a back seat to logistics.
Physics always wins in the end. China currently manufactures about a quarter of the world's transformers. The supply chain there is deep, and crucially, it's fast. The International Energy Agency data shows huge backlogs globally, but Chinese manufacturers can still deliver.
So if you need it by next summer,
you're likely buying from China, tariffs or no tariff.
And the market is reacting to this in real time. We're recording this on January 19th, 2026. And looking at the stock tickers today, the grid equipment sector is on fire.
It is.
Companies like Double G and Han Cable hit their upper limits.
Yeah.
Even the ETFs tracking this sector are seeing record inflows.
Investors are waking up to the fact that this isn't a temporary blip. This is a structural shift.
Yeah.
This shortage is going to define the rest of the decade. But honestly, while the export story is the one grabbing headlines, I think the bigger story is what's happening domestically.
I agree. It feels like the export boom is just the tip of the iceberg. The State Grid Corporation of China just dropped their investment plan for the 15th five-year plan, covering 2026 through 2030. And the number is just startling.
4 trillion RMB.
It's hard to even visualize that much money.
To give it some context, that is a 40% increase over the previous 5-year period. It is the largest single investment in power grid infrastructure in history. Anywhere. And they aren't just spending this money to replace old wires.
No, they're building something fundamentally new.
Exactly.
The State Grid chairman, Zhang Zigang, he laid out the strategy, and he broke it down into 4 key areas. I want to go through these because they paint a picture of what a future grid actually looks like. The first one was the main and microgrids collaborative platform.
Right, which addresses the fundamental geography problem of China. All the energy resources, the wind, the solar, the hydro, are predominantly in the West.
But the demand
is in the East. The factories, the cities, the data centers. They're thousands of kilometers apart.
Which leads directly to the second point, UHV, ultra-high voltage transmission.
This is the crown jewel of their technology. Standard high voltage lines lose a lot of power over long distances. It just dissipates as heat. UHV lines running at 800 or 1,000 kilovolts act like an energy superhighway.
Wow.
They can push massive amounts of power across the continent with minimal loss. The plan aims to boost this cross-regional capacity by 30% over the next 5 years.
That is a massive engineering feat. But the third area of investment felt a bit more grounded. They talked about distribution networks and specifically off-grid microgrids.
This is a shift towards resilience. Instead of relying entirely on one big centralized pulse, they're funding the creation of self-sustaining energy islands, particularly in remote areas.
So solar panels, batteries.
Solar panels, wind turbines, and battery storage, all managed locally. If the main line goes down, the microgrid keeps running. It's decentralization in action.
And then we get to the fourth area, which I think is the most sci-fi part of the plan. They explicitly mentioned digital infrastructure and implementing AI plus actions.
And this is where we close the loop. We started by saying AI is creating a problem by demanding power. Now, the state grid is saying they will use AI to solve the problem of managing that power.
What does that actually look like in practice? I mean, why does a power grid need artificial intelligence?
Because the grid is becoming too complex for humans to manage. In the old days, power flowed one way. From the power plant to the city to your house, it was predictable.
Right.
But now, you have millions of electric vehicles plugging in and unplugging at random times. You have rooftop solar sending power back into the grid when the sun shines. You have wind farms that fluctuate second by second.
It's chaotic.
It is chaos. No human operator can flip switches fast enough to balance that load in real time across an entire continent. You need AI to predict the weather, predict usage patterns, and route the electrons where they need to go instantly.
They're turning the grid from a dumb pipe into a smart digital platform.
That's it, exactly.
The scale of what they're trying to manage is immense. The plan mentions these targets for 2030, like having non-fossil energy account for 25% of consumption. But the one that really stood out to me was the EV charging.
The 40 million charging piles, yes.
40 million!
Just pause and think about the physics of that. 40 million heavy appliances. Imagine even half of them plugging in at 6 p.m. when people get home from work. The surge in demand is instantaneous and massive.
And without a smart grid.
That surge blows the fuses. The system collapses.
So the 4 trillion RMB isn't just a nice to have. It's basically survival money if they want to hit these EV and green energy targets.
It is the absolute prerequisite. You cannot have a modern electric economy without a grid that can handle it.
This really helps synthesize the two stories we've been discussing. On the international front, you have this frantic restocking cycle. The West is trying to patch holes and find enough transformers to keep the data centers running.
Right. It's defensive spending. It's all about preventing blackouts and clearing backlogs.
Whereas domestically in China, this 4 trillion investment feels offensive. It's strategic. They are building a new kind of machine.
The scale dictates the strategy. In 2025, China's electricity consumption broke 10 trillion kilowatt hours. That's a 5% jump in a single year. The state grid expects to add 200 million kilowatts of wind and solar capacity annually for the next 5 years.
200 million kilowatts a year. That's roughly the size of Germany's entire installed capacity.
Added every single year.
Wow.
And that's just in renewables. When you operate at that velocity, you change the economics of the entire industry. This is why the transformer boom is not a bubble. It's the physical manifestation of the next industrial revolution.
No, electrifying everything.
And that requires a lot of metal.
It's a great reality check. You know, we get so caught up in software in the cloud, in the code, but the cloud is just a building full of hot servers that needs air conditioning and a massive connection to a power plant.
Exactly. You can't have the digital economy without the physical economy. If you're bullish on AI, if you're bullish on EVs, then you are implicitly bullish on the companies that make the gray boxes on the utility poles.
So what for our listeners, pretty clear. The bottleneck for the future isn't silicon, it's electrical steel. It's the grid itself.
We are entering the golden age of high voltage. It's a very good time to be in the business of infrastructure.
I want to leave everyone with a final thought, something that has been sticking with me since you mentioned that AI Plus plan.
Sure.
We usually frame AI as this consumer, right? It eats data, it eats electricity. But the state grid plan flips the script. It uses AI to control the electricity.
Mm-hmm.
If this works, if they successfully integrate AI into the management of a 4 trillion yuan grid, are we witnessing the birth of something else?
It raises a profound question. If the grid creates a network that can sense, react, predict, and self-heal across millions of nodes, does the grid itself become a singular entity?
A singular entity? What do you mean?
Well, think about it. We are building a machine that spans a continent, making millions of autonomous decisions every second to keep the energy flowing. Is the electrical grid becoming the world's largest robot?
Not a robot with legs that walks around, but
a massive breathing nervous system that powers everything else.
That is a slightly terrifying but also incredibly cool image. The grid as a living organism.
It's probably closer to reality than we might think.
Well, on that note, the next time you walk past one of those humming gray boxes on the street, maybe give it a little nod of respect. It might just be the most important piece of tech you see all day.
I certainly will.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the 4 trillion yuan grid. We'll catch you next time.